Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 235 of Humanity Rising. I want to note that this is King's Day in Holland. I want to say hello to all of our Dutch participants. The Dutch have been very present in Humanity Rising since the very beginning. I've lived in Holland for many, many months at a time over the last number of years. It's become a second home, and this is one of the loveliest days in Holland. It's springtime. The tulips are coming out, and on King's Day, everybody wears orange, which is the national color of the Netherlands. So I just wanted to note that. And more broadly, as they celebrate in a time of COVID, just to note the amazing resilience of humanity as we traverse our various holidays and consecrations. Very recently, we noted the Passover, Easter, now Ramadan, New Year's in India, and in many countries in Asia, as different traditions celebrate various occasions in the course of the year, now under the constraints of COVID, of course, but nevertheless, human celebrations persist and continue, and that is very healthy and nurtures the soul. Let us begin our session today by nurturing our own souls. Just take a moment, center yourself in your body, take a few deep breaths, and place your attention on your heart. Just for a minute or two, place your attention on your heart and listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of thanksgiving and deep gratitude that you're alive. We're all alive at this extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude for each and every one of you who are joining our session today, I want to commence the program by just noting that there are some events in history that are beyond imagination in terms of the darkness that they represent. And yet they're a magnet at the same time that compels all of us to look at them almost as if we're looking at the sun with the naked eye. And that is what happens when we contemplate the Holocaust. Easily the greatest crime in human history, where with scientific precision and the mobilization of an entire nation and other nations, the Nazis systematically eliminated millions of people, 6 million of whom were Jews. That crime didn't happen in ancient antiquity. It happened in the memory of people that are still alive and challenged our categories of what it means to be human with a shattering fierceness that continues to reverberate at a global level. So today we want to contemplate that event, and we want to look at it through the prism of the children of Holocaust survivors who are now in the second phase of their lives. They're now sages. They're now mature people who have had the time to reflect almost with a distant mirror the events that their parents went through and survived. And that's why these people are here. Within this context, I want to introduce someone who's become a friend, an associate of mine over the last several months. Ronnie Dunetz lives in Israel. His father was a Holocaust survivor. He will tell you the details of that. Made his way to the United States and Israel. And Ronnie was one of his children. Ronnie is a business consultant. He has developed a whole series of seminars and workshops and consulting around saging, around the development of wisdom in this second half of life. He also is a doctoral student at Ubiquity University, doing his doctoral dissertation on the very matters that he is going to convene this session around today. And in fact, it was in discussions with Ronnie as we began to get to know each other, because I like to meet and get acquainted with every single one of our doctoral students, that when I found out what he was working on and the story of his life, I said, you need to come on to Humanity Rising and just share the wisdom, the light that you've been able to glean over deep reflection in terms of an event that represents probably the epitome of transgenerational trauma. And the challenge that all of us have, whatever our traumas, is to amalgamate them within a deeper substrate of wisdom and compassion, so that somehow, in some mysterious way, we're sculpted into more morally mature beings. Because the Holocaust can never happen again. And that requires our eternal vigilance about our shadow content and how to redeem ourselves through a deeper commitment. So, Ronnie, I want to welcome you. It's a pleasure and a privilege to have you and your friends share with us this deep transition of the human soul out of great darkness. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim, and all of the Humanity Rising staff. I'm very honored and touched by this invitation and looking forward to this event. I can tell you a bit about what we're going to do today. I have invited 3 of my colleagues, all of whom are children of Holocaust survivors. And after I give about a 10-minute introduction to the topic itself, to give you kind of parameters what we're talking about, I'd like to invite one by one to give their 15-minute discussion about how they're reflecting on their experience of being a child of a Holocaust survivor. Then I will actually talk last about half the time, because I want to show a film of 17 minutes, which I put together on my own father's story very recently, which I think is a good sum up and a good ending to our very special event here. So thank you again for being with us here. The Holocaust, as Jim mentioned, was an unprecedented, horrific event. I won't go into it so much because it was a horrific event for humanity, but it was even a more horrific event for the Jewish people. It devastated the Jewish people. Before the Holocaust, before World War II in 1939, there were 9 million Jews in Europe. At the end of 6 years, 2/3 had been decimated, had been killed. Some countries were lucky to get away because the Nazis' diabolical extermination industry didn't get to them enough. But some countries like Greece and Slovakia and Yugoslavia had 90% of their Jews exterminated. In Poland, which was the largest Jewish community at the time outside of the United States, 90% were killed. When we talk about Holocaust survivors, I want to give you an idea what we're talking about. It's a term that's sometimes not very clear to people. What we're talking about here are people who actually endured the atrocities and the killing machine, their parents, of the Nazi regime, wherever it was. There are Holocaust survivors who are also called, who fled Nazis, mostly into the Soviet Union, and they survived the war. But our group here are people coming from the first group there, unfortunately. What is amazing is that 20 years after the Holocaust, which was over 1945, nobody really wanted to talk about it. It seemed that the world didn't know how to deal with this tremendous tragedy of unprecedented scope. On the one hand, Israel, where 2/3 of the survivors ended up, didn't really want to hear the Holocaust survivors. They wanted them to be new Jews, free Jews, to come into the new state of Israel. So there weren't many people who were open to listening. On the other hand, the survivors themselves had a hard time getting rid of the trauma out of the situation they came from. They weren't always very open to talking about it. We'll hear that from our panelists today. The amazing thing is that so many of these survivors who went through such extraordinary trauma did manage to rebuild their lives very quickly. So much so that in the first years of the state of Israel in the early 50s, 1 out of every 4 Israeli was a Holocaust survivor. They were very, very critical in the upcoming state and the War of Independence. Beginning in the 1970s, things started to change. First of all, they noticed that second generation, they weren't called second generation yet, they also noticed that Holocaust survivors started to talk more. They started to come out more. And they started to talk about their experiences. Now we're talking about a good 20, 30 years after the Holocaust. Dr. Irit Felsen, who is a clinical psychologist of great repute, herself a daughter of Holocaust survivors, she studies this population. She says many of these people who lived with trauma didn't actually show trauma. They live with like what may be seen as a glass floor. At the top, they seem very normal. They seem to go about life. But underneath the glass floor were all the traumatic experiences. To many, they never spoke about it. To some, they spoke obsessively. And to others, you had to know how to go about doing what you had to do. Let's talk about the second generation. The second generation are people that were born to Holocaust survivors. This term became popular in the 1970s. Now, I want you to understand something. They're not one group. They're a very varied, very diverse group of people. Some of them didn't have any real influence that could be spoken of or they were aware of, because there was a great difference in socioeconomic background, in educational background, in the geography they're coming from, the religiosity they're coming from. In short, they were very, very different. On the other hand, there have been more than 500 research studies to date that show that even though there is not any specific algorithm saying who will have trauma and who will have vestiges of their parents' traumatic situation, they have shown that within the second generation, there is a certain characteristics that are more protruding. And I will talk about that in a second. On the other hand, those who are more traumatized in the second generation were actually those who were children of parents who showed PTSD or other post-traumatic symptoms. So let's be careful not lump everyone together. Let's talk about what are some of the characteristics they found, even though they're in the normative range, that many second generations, whether or not they call themselves that or not, what they shared. On the one hand, on the more difficult side, they've shown a greater tendency to psychological separation, difficulties leaving home and making decisions. Very often you'll hear from second generations, they didn't want to upset the parents. They wanted to protect the parents. There was a real need. Even sometimes they put the parents' needs ahead of their own. Many second generations talked about not being able to raise the issue, not being able to talk to the parents. Lots of silence is there because you didn't want to hurt this parent to remember what they went through. I must say that many second generations don't know what their parents went through. And this is quite sad, in my opinion. Many families many second generation, have a higher levels of PTSD. They're more anxious. There is more alienation, more sensitivity, more vulnerability. But again, it's not out of the normative range, but there is a tendency. And finally, there are some families, I know of some, which are dysfunctional, that the parent, the Holocaust survivor parent, could not get it together to give the emotional support of a parent. I know quite a few like that. And so they were really pretty battered as children, not physically, but emotionally. But on the other hand, the complete other side of the spectrum, there have been more and more studies shown that second generation, that is, children, survivors of Holocaust, are more endowed with resilience. They have a sense of steelness, they call it a hardiness, where they're able to show their toughness, able to get by with minimal amount of things. They're able to delay gratification. They're quite resourceful, make do with what they have. They know, and if they have something to get behind, a cause, be it a child who has special needs, they've been shown to have amazing, amazing resilience, determination. These second generations, they have resilience. Again, not all, but they found it more and more than the general population. On the other hand, they've also found the second generation children, they're not children anymore, they're in the middle age and the second half of life. They may have a problem of letting go of things, letting go of people. They work tremendously hard, and they're above average in their levels of higher education, professional stature, and overall success. One last thing I would say is that they've also shown to be overly represented in the helping professions. And you may see that right here on this panel here, that more second generation are doing things to help other people. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful place to be. I would like, with that background, to go and introduce our first speaker. Rosalind Franken. Rosalind was born in Montreal, Canada, to a Dutch-born Holocaust survivor mother, who survived 11 concentration camps, including 3 trips to the gas chambers in Auschwitz and the death march in Czechoslovakia. After the war, her mother married Rosalind's father, a Dutch-Indonesian Jew who survived the atomic bomb as a prisoner of war in Japan. When diagnosed with cancer at the age of 29, Rosalind turned to her parents' strength and positivity as inspiration in her fight to beat cancer and overcome many other life obstacles. She is an author and public speaker dedicated to inspiring people with hope and courage for creating positive and meaningful change in their lives and the world around them. Her book about her parents' lives and their positive influence is now being made into a movie. Welcome, Razan. Please.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for this opportunity. I accept every opportunity to share this kind of information to educate and inspire people. So I'll start by telling you about my mother and then tell you about her influence on me as the daughter of such a survivor. So my mother was born on February 6, 1926, in a small town in the Netherlands called Racen. And at age 15, she was taken from her home by the Nazis to Camp Vught, which was the first of a series of camps she suffered, which was a transit camp in the southern part of the Netherlands. It was at age 15. Now, immediately upon arrival at this camp, she was brutally forced apart from both her parents, her two brothers, and her oldest of three sisters. And I try to imagine what that was like for her, to watch all those family members being taken away, having no clue where they were being taken and if she would even see them again. It breaks my heart to even try to imagine something so horrific. But sadly, that was the last time my mother ever saw all those family members. She found out after the war that they were all taken to Camp Sobibor, that extermination camp in Poland where so many people were murdered, and they were all killed. But thankfully for my mother, and she had two remaining sisters, their lives were spared. They were put to forced labor working for a company still popular today called Philips Electronics, where she worked as a slave laborer in the radio assembly plant, putting radios together. And from there, she was taken to Auschwitz, which we know the living conditions there were horrific. If you didn't get killed in the gas chambers, you would die of starvation, malnutrition, infectious diseases, forced labor, and individual executions, and sometimes even horrific medical experiments. And it was here in Auschwitz where my mother was registered with a tattooed number on her left arm, like the branding of an animal, and she became number 78491. And one time she was interviewed about her wartime experiences, and they asked her, why don't you have the tattoo removed like many other survivors? My mother said, no way, I won't take it off because then people can see it. Then people can see that it's true because some people say it never happened. Nothing infuriated my mother more than hearing from these Holocaust deniers who we know still exist among us today, who say the whole thing was a hoax, it never happened. Right. Now, 3 times, my mother faced death in the gas chambers and survived. How is that possible? 3 times there was either a malfunction in the gas supply, or they had gas so many people through that day they had run out of gas. And before they could fix the problem, she was being put on a train and being shipped off to another camp. She was in 11 different camps in total. So if this happened once, you could say maybe she was lucky. 2 times, coincidence. 3 times, she would tell you, as we say in Yiddish, right, beschert. It was meant to be. Now, my mother also was put to forced labor working on the railroads. And she said it was backbreaking work, and she blamed a lot of her back pain and back problems that plagued her for the rest of her life. She blamed on those days of working on the railroads. And she said that if you saw somebody who stopped to take a rest or catch their breath, if they got caught, they would be shot dead. So I asked her, what kept you going? And she said, she kept repeating in her mind over and over. She said, Hitler will never get me. I have too much to live for. What kept her going was this dream and this hope that one day she was going to find her true love and have a family of her own. That's what she lived for. And in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, a psychiatrist who was in the concentration camps, he observed and he said that the people who had the most resiliency and the most will to live and that willpower were people like my mother, who had a strong sense of purpose. That's what kept them going compared to those who gave up so quickly. So that was my mother. So now after the war, my mother, as mentioned in the introduction, met my father, who was a Dutch Indonesian Jew, um, who was in the Dutch Navy Air Force, captured by the Japanese, and he survived the Nagasaki atomic bomb as a prisoner of war. He was in the Dutch Navy Air Force. So he survived World War II as well, just on the opposite side of the world. So they had a very strong understanding of each other and connection by that. So my mother immigrated to Montreal, where my father already was. And she had her husband, she had her kids, she was living her dream. And then at age 56, 1983, she gets told she has cancer. Now, after all she suffered, how easy it would have been for her to play the victim and feel sorry for herself and want to give up. No. Instead, you know what she said? She said to the surgeon, she said, "You see this number on my arm from Auschwitz?" She said, "Hitler didn't get me. My cancer won't get me. I have too much to live for." Again, that was her strength and attitude. And the doctors gave her 2 years tops to live with the strongest chemo at the time. And guess what? She lived for another 21 years. And in those years, her cancer came back 5 times. But if you ever asked her, "Sonia, how are you doing?" She would say in her little Dutch accent, she would say, "Me, I am like the Energizer batteries. I just keep going and going." So now, having heard all that with just snippets of what she suffered, if you ask me, what was it like growing up as the daughter of the survivor? How has it affected me and my life? I could tell you, I could probably write a second book on this topic alone, but a few things I want to share. I don't know how young I was when I first knew that my mother survived the Holocaust, that she lost her family, that she suffered so much. But I know that from as long as I can remember, I always had this strong need to please my mother, to make her proud of me, to protect her from any more pain and suffering than she already had. And some people would say, what a burden that was, and what a hardship. And no, I never saw it that way. For me, I felt it was my duty to give her as much joy and love and nachas, there's a good word, nachas, as I could, to give her that kind of joy that I felt she so deserved. And I remember her saying to me, she said, "Rosalind, you are special. And I know that you are one who will one day make a difference in this world." And I will never forget her saying that. And I pray to God that now that she's passed on, I pray that she is looking down, knowing the work that I am doing with my book, with my speaking engagements, with my movie, in wanting to educate and inspire people with her story, both my parents' story, to be better people and help make this world a better place. Now, my mother taught me so many things, but one thing was, what do we place value on in this life? What's truly important and meaningful? And a very simple, basic thing was food. In my house, food was something never to be wasted, never to be taken for granted. And I remember my mother taking me, literally calling me into the kitchen one day. I was pretty young at the time. And we stood in front of the fridge, and she put her arm around me and she opened up the fridge, and there was a fridge full of food. And all she said to me with a big smile on her face, she said, "Look, sweetheart, we are rich." And I'll never forget that, because to my mother, after what she suffered and understanding what real hunger is, that is what rich means, having a fridge full of food. Now, to my mother, her biggest joy was having friends and family around the table for a meal and enjoying each other's company, having a home that was welcome and inviting and cozy and comfortable for people. Her focus was all about relationships. My mother placed no value on things that were materialistic. She didn't care about expensive jewelry or having a big house or fancy car or any of that. That's not what was important. It was about friendships and family, because material things can easily be replaced, but not your loved ones. And that stuck with me. And I live my life, again, that same way. And a big thing of what my mother taught me was and by example, she didn't even have to verbally say it, she just taught me by example, that we all have what I call a superhuman power, and it's called the power of choice. We have the power to choose every thought we have, every belief we hold, and every action we take. And I think about what my mother went through in the Holocaust, and then later in life with cancer on top of that, right? It would have been so easy for her to be bitter for the rest of her life, but my mother always chose to be better and not bitter. And that really stays with me, that I have that same power of choice. So now the way that I live my life and the influence from my mother, from both my parents really, is to approach my own life's challenges with that same faith and fortitude instead of constant fear, right? That same daring and determination, that same positivity and perseverance instead of this poor me attitude I hear so many people walking around with these days. Everybody throwing themselves a big old pity party. And that's not how I live my life. And I think for me, it really, what brought it home was when I myself was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 29. And at first it was like, oh my God, what's going to happen to me? Am I going to die? How could I have cancer? I'm 29 years old. I'm full of plans and hopes and dreams for my future. But after that initial shock and fear and starting, the treatments and all the side effects and everything, I really started to think about my parents, and especially my mother, who was going through cancer treatments at the same time as me. Can you imagine? I remember her telling me, when I told her, she put her hands together and she looked up and she said, please God, give it to me. I can take it, but not my little girl, right? Because even at 29, you're your mother's little girl. But in any case, I decided then I am going to turn to my mother as my inspiration to beat my cancer and overcome many other obstacles that have come my way. And by making that choice myself, I was able to draw on her strength and that keep going attitude. No matter how bad life gets, you just keep going. So you know what? Now when I'm having a bad day, going through a hard time, it's what I say to people. You think you're going through a hard time, having a bad day, think about people like my mother and what they went through in prior generations. Use them like I did as inspiration. Turn to them as your inspiration for going through hard times. And lastly, my mother was a shining example, a true testimony to somebody who gives us all hope that you can go through terrible things in life, but you can still find joy in the aftermath. And she's my inspiration to all the work that I'm doing. So I'm a very, very proud daughter of a Holocaust survivor who basically feels I've been very positively influenced by her. And there's a reason why she survived. And I take it upon myself that there's a reason why I am here. And I want to make the most of it and do her justice with all the work that I'm doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosin, for those beautiful words. Very touching story. Thank you. Pleased to present Noam Salpeter. Noam, maybe you can unmute here. Noam is an old friend of mine for over 30 years, and a very special person. He has been working as a psychotherapist in a variety of settings for the past 3 decades. He has a special interest in cultural, mind, body, and psycho-spiritual elements in the healing process in general, and particularly in trauma and recovery. While many clinicians focus on pathology in Holocaust survivors and their children, Noam developed interest in a non-pathological health-supporting elements in this legacy. Noam's mother and her parents escaped Nazi Germany before World War II. His father, however, was born in Czechoslovakia and survived concentration camps and the Death March, losing most of his family members in the Holocaust. His father later emigrated to Israel to become one of Israel's most respected journalists through his retirement in 2007. His father passed away in 2016. Please, Noah.
All right. Thank you very much. I want to thank, I am thanking Humanity Rising for hosting this event, and to Ronnie for organizing it, to the fellow presenters, and to you, the audience. We were asked to talk a little bit about our parents who survived the Holocaust, and then our understanding or take on how that affected us. So I want to start by mentioning that my father, when I was growing up, my father never spoke about the Holocaust, about his experiences. And that in and of itself had effect, as Ronnie has pointed out to me as well. So I'll get back to that, but let me say a little bit about my father and his experience. So he was born in a little town called Slatina in near the Ukrainian-Romanian border in 1927. His name is Eliyahu, he was known as Ernst. And when he was 17, him and all of his extended family were taken to the concentration camps. That's a euphemism, it's basically extermination camps. And he was actually quickly taken out of Auschwitz to a so-called labor camp, which was actually slave camp. My father told me that the dominant experiences there were constant hunger, knowing that you can be killed for any reason at any moment, and also that you were not really a person, you were an object. What you wanted and who you were did not really count. It, can be at the mercy of other people. He survived these experiences, he would say, mostly by luck, but I later would add also thanks to his ingenuity and the kindness of other people, which is also important in terms of how it affected him and through him, me. At the end of World War II, the Russians were advancing, and then the Germans were retreating, and took a lot of the surviving inmates with them to Germany. This was the infamous death march where a lot of the inmates end up dying. And he ended up in Bergen in Germany, where he was liberated by the Allies. He was able to later go to Czechoslovakia, to Prague, was reunited with his father, which is one of 3 people who survived from the whole entire family. Him, his father, and 2 aunts survived. And he was suffering from tuberculosis and malnutrition and so on, was treated, ended up moving to a little town called Chomutov with his father, where his father worked as a doctor, and he completed his high school that was interrupted by the Holocaust, and then went on to study in Prague, economics and journalism. He became a young journalist there, and then in 1949 left to Israel, the new country of Israel that was established in 1948. He was never able to return to Czechoslovakia because as a journalist, he was not a supporter of communism, and then somebody ended up warning him a little bit later after he left that should he return, he will be immediately arrested. He went on to be one of the leading and most respected journalists in Israel for about 50 years, like Ronnie said, until his retirement, focusing mostly on Israeli internal and international politics and on Jewish issues of Jewish communities around the world. He was well known for his humor, curiosity, and vast knowledge. I want to also talk a little bit about my mom because, like like Ronnie mentioned in the beginning, she's not classically considered a Holocaust survivor, but if we're talking about the soup that I am, this is one of the ingredients, and there is also a connection to the Holocaust. So her parents end up in Germany before World War II, where her father, who was very interested in researching Jewish law, also practiced general law and ended up becoming a judge. When my mom was 2, at the age of 1933, a fellow judge pulled my grandfather to his chambers, telling him that actually he saw his name on a list of people to be arrested. So the following day, without any provisions, much money, luggage, etc., my grandfather, grandma, and my 2-year-old mom left, escaped, and eventually found their way to Israel, to Palestine. And then he eventually was able to work again in academia, researching Jewish law. And then in 1948, during the War of Independence, he, with some other people from the academia and people from medical personnel from the Jerusalem-based hospital, were on their way to Jerusalem that was under siege. The convoy was ambushed, and he and other people were murdered. And that was a famous convoy to Mount Scopus. So at the age of 16, my mother became the main breadwinner in the family. Her mother didn't speak that good of Hebrew and was a housewife, didn't have a profession that she could practice. My mom was taken under the wing of a close family friend who later encouraged her to study law. And she became a lawyer, spending most of her career, actually all of her career, working with people with disabilities, disadvantaged people, and basically doing social work in legal ways, being a legal consultant to social workers and volunteers, established a lot of things. And to this day, at the age of 91, she still volunteers some of her time. So I'm telling you this because we're talking about the impact on me. So I want to start with the fact that my father didn't talk about the Holocaust until we were adults. He told us, I was protecting you, I don't know if I did the right thing. But being surrounded by knowing that, and also, of course, hearing from other survivors and growing up in Israel, you also hear a lot about the Holocaust and study about it. The net result was that I had a lot of preoccupation with the Holocaust, a lot of fears, fantasies, nightmares, a lot of preoccupation with good and evil, with, what makes people do what they do. Also, something maybe a little unusual, I don't know, that it used to make me angry when I would hear people dismiss the Nazis as monsters or animals, and the Jews who were killed as weak or coward, that they didn't resist, that they went like sheep to the slaughterhouse. Because for me, part of the legacy is trying to see, can this happen again, and how to prevent it? And to me, these kind of judgments actually almost made sure that things like that would happen again to the Jewish people and to other people, because my understanding back then was that we're more or less all of us capable of doing both, on both sides. So you can guess, I went on to be interested in psychology and in spirituality, and after a couple of detours, ended up being a psychotherapist. When I was doing my master's work in psychology, I started out by wanting to disprove the concept of second generation of Holocaust survivors. I rebelled against the idea that the fact that we were born out of people who underwent a certain experience made us defective, or whatever you want to call it, trauma victims as well. So through doing some reading and interviews and talking with other people, I concluded that actually there is a thing such as the transmission of trauma across generations. But what I also found out is that the other side of that coin is that also healing passes through generations. I later found out that in a lot of native traditional cultures, there's that belief as well, that the healing passes through generation. But in our context, I concluded that maybe such a severe trauma cannot be healed in one generation. And so each generation and each person does their part in healing that. And so I became interested, as Jim and Ronnie mentioned, in the issue of resiliency and what makes a person have a certain experience, what makes something trauma, and how can we use whatever experience for positive. And one of the metaphors that came to me, if you think about a soup and like the spice being, let's say, the trauma, many things will influence the end taste of the soup. How much of the spice you put, what other spices you put, how much water you put. And in some ways, if you dilute it, if it's too spicy, if you dilute it down enough to be eaten and digested, then you can utilize it in a good way. And so maybe that's part of what happened when it's quote unquote transferred to another generation. I also became interested in what people do with their experience, in the sense of the meaning, like Rosalind mentioned, Viktor Frankl and others are talking about. And one of the things that my father said to me that really stuck in my mind, we had maybe 2 conversations in my whole life about the Holocaust when I was an adult, and the rest I pieced together from things that I've heard. But he said to me, at the end of the war, I had all the proof, all the reason to not trust another human being again. All the atrocities he has witnessed and experienced, all the torture, all the horrific things that were done, the betrayal by neighbors and by people in general. But he said, I realized that I could not live, or at least that life would not be worth living in that case. So I chose explicitly and intentionally chose to trust people again. And he was able to love and to raise a family and to be a good person and to develop friendships and so on and so forth. And so did my mom. Once I asked my mom about how come I didn't see my parents fight when I was young, because that happened in most households, that once in a while the parents fight. And she told me that what both my parents have gone through in their life, the amount of suffering and losses, she said nothing in that context, nothing was serious or severe enough for us to actually fight about. So these different things influenced me, not just as a person, but also when I work with people, the context in which I take the experience. And I sometimes tell clients that I encourage them to not waste their experience or waste their suffering, that something can be made of it. At the same time, I'm also aware of what I mentioned my father said about the role of luck, so that not to put too much burden on myself or on other people, that it's all up to us entirely. That's a mixture. And I want to end with a famous metaphor that I use a lot in my life and in my work, which is the example of manure. If you have a pile of manure, it can be stinking, it can attract flies, it can cause disease. But if you tend it and attend to it in a good way, it can become compost and it can be a source of life, so source of nutritious food. And I think that I and other people strive to do that, both with ourselves and in the world. in many traditional societies, some of them tribal, some of them traditions like Judaism, there is the responsibility of the individual towards the generations that came before them and after them. And so in that spirit, I want to wish all of us that may we be part of the healing and not just of legacy of pain. Thank you.
Thank you, Noam, very much. I'm really touched by what your father said, which I wasn't aware of, that he chose to trust people. Very, very powerful statement. Thank you, Noam. Nili Noam, can you please unmute?
Yep. I'm not in.
Your camera, Nili?
Yes.
So I will, as you put your camera on, Nili, I'll introduce you. Okay.
Yep. Nelly, try it again, Nelly.
There you go. Okay, you're on. Good. So Nili was born and lives in Israel.
I did.
Okay, Nili has had decades of experience as an alternative medicine therapist, reflexology, and other things. She integrates global clinical training with a continuing career in acting, cinema, and television. She is married and mother of two. Her father, Yecheskel ben Shlomo, was born in Poland, and at the age of only 11, when World War II broke out, he was taken into the ghetto city of Lodz and eventually to Auschwitz. He survived various death marches and was liberated in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. He and one of his sisters were the only children of the family in Poland who survived. His mother and 7 siblings, some of whom were married with children, perished. Nili's father came to Israel after the war in 1947, where he rebuilt his life and raised a family until passing away suddenly at the age of 64. Nili feels that the best compliment you can give her when someone comments, "You are exactly the same as your father." Please, Nili.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Ronnie. Hello, can you hear me now? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ronnie, and thank you, Humanity Rising, for this opportunity. So as Ronnie said, my father, Yecheskel ben Shlomo, was only 11 when the war broke out. In 1 minute, he lost everything. He lost his family, he lost his house, he lost his childhood, and eventually he lost his personality. He only became a number that was tattooed on his arm, and just a number in the Nazis' list. However, as Ronnie mentioned, he went through Lodz ghetto, which was the worst ghetto. Now we know, researchers show us that ghetto Lodz was the worst ghetto of all, because there the German did a lot of experiences, like trying to see if people can survive on 145 calories per day. Yes, 145 calories per day. This is starvation. My father told me that his sister, his beloved sister, who was just 3 years older than him, died in his hand in ghetto Lodz, and they had to bury her in the middle of the night so the Nazi won't see it in ghetto Lodz, in a Lodz cemetery, not far from his father, who died a year and a half before the war broke out. Dying of starvation, my father said, is the worst death. Therefore, as you understand, in years to come, food was an issue in our house. And just, I was very touched by Rosalind when she said that her mother loved the table to be full and a lot of people from her family members and friends to be around and have fun with food. My father, just the same. This would made him very, very happy, being together with a table full of food and a refrigerator full of food as well. I can talk hours about my father because he did talk and he did told me several things that he passed through. Of course, when I was a child, when I was a very young child, something like 3, 4, 5, when I first realized that he has been through a war when he was a child, he was trying to protect me and he didn't want to speak about it. He didn't want to tell me anything about it. Nevertheless, I was a very curious girl and I asked a lot of questions, and eventually he told me. He told me whatever I could accept at my age. And when I was aging, with my age, he spoke more and told me some more things, some more details. My highest experience with him was that I was with him in Auschwitz on the rampa where the train stopped, and him and his family members, who was his mother, his beloved mother, he was the 12th child. And he was always making a joke that he was 7 years before he was born, he was an uncle already. So that means that his nephews and nieces were much older than he is. Several from his brothers and sisters were married by that time and came with their families. When they came to Auschwitz and were on the rampa, that was the last time he saw his family members, including his beloved mother. He didn't know that he is going to separate from them, of course. His brother, who stood just behind him, told him, make yourself higher, make yourself bigger. So he stepped on his toes just to look higher. And then when they passed through the selection, he was sent right, like his brother, and the rest of the family members went left, directly to the death, directly to the gas chambers. He didn't know what happens to them. He kept on asking, where is my mother? But where is my mother? After 3 days of him asking all the people in his block, in where they lived, some of the older people told him, you see that smoke up there? This is your mother. At that point, he didn't want to live anymore. He told me all the time that he was so loved by his mother that he thought that he would never live another day without her. However, many years has passed through and he lived. He used to force to work also in labor, like Rosalind mentioned, like making the trailways or just putting rocks on their backs and going from one side, taking the rocks off and then putting them back and going back to the same place where they were before, just to make them work and to try to see, well, they survive or not. However, he was liberated in Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, and was sent to Sweden with some other Polish survivors, where they spent about half a year, 6 months, getting ready to come to Israel. They went on a boat to Israel, and when they came here, the British, who was here in the mandate of the British mandate, caught them and sent them to Cyprus. My father had already a certificate, a visa to come to Israel that he had from 1939, and so he could come to Israel. When he came to Israel, he joined his oldest brother and 2 sisters who were here already. He was born in an Orthodox Zionist family that they were getting ready to come to Israel, but the war has stopped them. So one brother was a pioneer, he came here like a pioneer before the rest of the family, with 2 sisters. From the whole sisters and brothers that we stayed in Poland, as Ronnie just mentioned, one sister is the only one who survived like my father. When they met here in Tel Aviv, he told me that they went through each other, they just passed through each other and they didn't recognize each other after 6 years of horrible war that did a lot of scars to each and every one of them. Nevertheless, my father was a very joyful person, a very happy person, a very loving person. I remember that as a child, I felt like I need to protect him after all he has been through. Though I was the child and he was protecting me, I felt like I have to protect him. And there's a small story that I'd like to tell you. When I was about 11, funny, I was bitten by a dog and I was bleeding. And I told my friend, I just tore my vein and there was a lot of blood. I didn't want to go home because I knew my father was there and my mother wasn't at home. And I didn't want him to see me bleeding because I know it would really make him shocked. So I went to my friend's home and I waited there for 4 hours. I was bleeding for 4 hours, waiting my mother to come back from work, just because I didn't want my father to see the blood. That was my way to protect him. When I came with him to Auschwitz, I just hugged him and I just was there, seeing his tears, being in tears with him. And just, I remember I just gave him a candy so his sugar levels won't drop down because of the stress. I feel like I was very honored to be there with him and to hear the story again, but from the very right spot where everything happened. I always was in his childhood house and the house in the ghetto where they used to live, of course. There was another thing about being a Holocaust survivor's daughter. I think something about choosing my profession. I was an actress as a child, and I was about to go to an art school, an art high school. But then I thought to myself that I need something more serious. I need a profession. So if something is going to happen, I'll have something that will provide me something that more, I guess it's something that has to do with existential the fear of not being able to support yourself and being the need of being independent. So I went to study electronics, and it was quite unusual at that time. I'm talking about the late 70s, for a girl to go to study electronics. I was the only girl in my class, but that came from that need to have a profession, to have a real profession. However, I did become an actress after all. And this is also something that happened to me. When I was doing my single show, I had a friend of my father, when actually I just found out that she was a friend of his sister, one of his sisters. She came to see me on stage, and then she came backstage with tears in her eyes, saying to me that, Neely, you look exactly like your aunt. You remind me your aunt just the same. She was also dancing and singing and acting and writing songs and writing poems just like you do. And at that point, I felt the loss of the whole family. It's an aunt that I never met. I don't have a photo of her. I don't have a picture. I never saw her. I never heard of her. And there was that lady talking to me about my aunt and how much the DNA is the same. I can talk more hours more about my father and what he has been through. So Ronnie, if you have some more questions or if you want to lead me somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything?
Yes, Neely, we talked a bit the other day about how the influence of your father's experience impacted your relationship to food.
Yes, well, I told you, my father said that starvation was the worst death ever. From some reason, I guess it's quite understandable. Maybe it's in the back of my mind, or in my unconscious mind, that being slim is not good, is being sick, is losing life. And if you want to stay alive and to be vital, then you have to be a bit chubby, let's say it that way. Because, you know, through the years, I tried to diet on so many diets, and I lost some weight and I gained it again. And you can say this could be the reason why I want to stay vital and I want to stay alive, like my father wanted.
Mhm.
And this is one of the love and hate relationship that I have with food.
Right. And Neely, one last point that you mentioned in our talk about how you feel the necessity to get back to people very quickly on the WhatsApp, on the email, the anxiety about connections with your family. Can you say a few words about that?
Yes. Well, for my father, family was in the first place. Family members were the most important people in his life. And so it's the same what I feel. My family members are the most important people in my life, including my own family, my husband, my children, and my brother and sister, which we keep on a very warm and close connection. And and you saw it, Ronnie, whenever my girl sends me a WhatsApp or she calls me, I have to answer immediately because she needs me or she wants to say something. And they are the most important people in my life. And if I call them and they don't answer me, then, you know, I try again and I try again. But third time they don't answer me, then I become very worried. And yes, there is an anxiety somewhere in the background. What
Okay,
else?
Neely, I think if anything else, this gives maybe your last comment on the subject of how you feel about the subject of the impact on you by your father's experience.
Well, listen, I don't know how is it not to be his daughter. So all I can say is what is for me to be his daughter. I was very honored to be his daughter. I feel like I'm very lucky that he is my father. And I know everybody loved him, and he was a people lover. I can give you another example of how much love he could give. At one point, my mother met a young guy that was a German, but from Poland. His family was from Poland and they moved to Germany, and he came to Israel. My mother asked my father whether she can ask him to stay with us for the first 3 days of him in Israel, because he had to go to the kibbutz, but he had 3 days to pass in Tel Aviv. So she asked him, and my father immediately said, yes, of course, welcome, welcome. And I asked my father, how can you do that? I mean, the Germans, they were being so nasty to you, and you always said that the Polish were the worst. So how can you open your heart and open your door to this guy? And so he said, Neely, this guy is about your age. He hasn't been through the war. He wasn't there at that time. So I said, yes, but his father probably was. And he said, okay, so his father was a child about my age. So I said, yes, but what about his father, the guy's grandfather? And my father told me, how many generations do you want to go back? That means he never forgot and he never forget. And he didn't forgive, but yet when you talk about person one-to-one, he could make he could find a difference between one person that he can attach to.
Thank you very much, Neely. Thank you very much for the beautiful sharing.
Thank you.
So I would like to share a little bit with you. I'll share a bit less here because I will be showing you a little film here. But I remember when I was a small child in America growing up, and the weekend would come about, and I'd be the first one up. I'd go downstairs, the corner of the living room. There was a book of photographs. And I'd take the photograph of that family lining up or standing in the background of some yard, black and white photo. And I remember this photo is from the town of Zhetl. Zhetl, which was then Poland, today Belarus. And I remember saying in that photo, where my father was as well, I can't believe so many of these people were killed. And I was only 5 or maybe 6 years old. I said, how does it happen? How do people get killed? Well, I won't tell you too much about my father because you'll see it in the film, but he was a Jewish educator. He was a journalist, and he talked about the Holocaust. Every Seder, Passover Seder, he'd get up and give a special dedication to the Holocaust. Every Holocaust day, he would speak in his community. But what I want to talk about here briefly is how my father's experience made my experience, how my father's experience made my identity. Now, I must say, I never liked the word second generation. Like Noah mentioned earlier, I didn't feel I was one of them. I didn't feel I was impacted or traumatized. However, I must say, coming up at the age of 62 soon, I see things a bit differently here. I see how this experience of my father shaped, morphed, and continues to shape my identity. And I'd like to make a few points here, how this identity has evolved over time. The first point in my identity is that of a Jew. I was born in America. I was raised in a Jewish community in New York. I knew mostly Jews. And I want to say that I felt the Holocaust as a Jew, as what it meant to be devastated, to be decimated, and how important it was to keep up the Jewish faith, to keep up the Jewish tradition. That was my first introduction. That was my first identity. But on the tails of that was the Zionist identity. The Zionism, which means bringing the Jews back to the homeland in Israel, was so poignant for me. After the Holocaust, where Jews had nowhere to go, had no one to take them in, were treated like dogs at best. I very much supported from early on the need to have a Jewish state and a secure Jewish state. When I became 21, I came to live in Israel, where I still live. That's why I live here. I did my military service, which is compulsory, and my children do their military service. My son is a combat commander in the reserve, and my daughter was an officer. And we're not military people. We just believe in this country. We believe in the necessity to keep this country going for the history of the Jews and the future of the Jews. But in my 20s, when I got up and I went away, I traveled to Asia, where I stayed for 5 years, studying different cultures and traditions and languages. I began to say, you know what? It's not just about Jews. This Holocaust was also a human tragedy. There were many people killed there. There were people killed all the time. I began to feel myself as part of the world. My global identity started to morph, to feel that this was the place that there was no contradiction between myself as an Israeli and myself as a human being. I felt the need to reach out to people as a son of a Holocaust survivor, to be sensitive, to be there for people who are being discriminated against, the downtrodden, those who are the objects of racism. And I said, I'm proud to be a Jew because as a Jew, I am a humanist. And I believe in sharing people's need and people's right to be safe, to be secure, and to be free. And that's how my identity evolved as a global person. But somewhere around 40, I started to see the story a bit different. I said, you know what? There's a personal story here. Yeah, it's true. World, Jew, Zionist, true. Israeli, of course. But there's a personal story. These were my grandparents. These were my uncles and aunts. Who were they? What kind of people were they? I want to know about them. If I don't know my own story, who will know it? So I started to study it, to genealogize it. And that's when I went with my father, and you'll see in the film, 21 years ago, to his village where the massacre was. This need to have a personal story is very strong within me. And I believe that we have to teach our children what went on with our parents and grandparents. But most recently, as I passed 60, I started to feel something different. It's true, there's a personal story, but there's something I may call, because I'm a Ubiquity student, a transpersonal journey. I want to find out what influence this experience has had on me in my choices in life, in my personal growth, in my spiritual growth, in why do I act the way I act? Because I think there's something there. I think there's a lot in that story of my father and his family, which is decimated, that has shaped my life. I want to study myself, but not just myself. I want to study second generations like me. And so I've come to Ubiquity for that purpose, to do a research on the second generation, the growth, the path, the spiritual search for meaning and identity. And I'm very excited about that. And this event is one step in that direction. I want to mention that in the Talmud, which is the discussions of the rabbis about the Torah, so 2,000 years ago, a book called The Ethics of the Fathers, it says the following: it's not your responsibility to finish the work of perfecting the world, but you are not free to desist from it either. In this spirit, I would like to share with you now a 17-minute clip of my father's story. It's a very personal story. I must share with you that I had a lot of misgivings. It's too personal to share. And just 3 weeks ago, I had an event of 130 people where I shared my father's story and this film. Feeling that now there is no such thing as too personal. We have to combat Holocaust denial, Holocaust distortion. We are the emissaries. We have to be out there and tell the story. It's a story to remember, not to forget. And I believe this is a summary, not only my words, but the words of all the panel here. And I will show you this film right now. Jim, at the end of this, when it's over, you can take it away. Thank you. Thank you. Let me know if there's any problem with the sound, please.
היי מצד אבי והי מצד אמי הקדושים והטהורים שמתו ושנהרגו ושנשחטו ושנשרפו ושנטבעו ושנחנקו על קידוש השם. חסדי הצוררים הגרמנים יימח שמם וזכרם טבעו. Today I got the answer. The answer that I asked on the very first day after it happened. Why was I privileged and selected from all the family to remain by myself? Was I remain I alive when the others went? Was I better than them? אני מעלה את הדברים האלה ברגשות מעורבים. אני מודע שזאת משימה לא קלה, ובכל זאת עליי החובה לספר לדורות הבאים אחריי את קורות המשפחה, מה קרה איתם ואיך הם גמרו את חייהם בשנות מלחמת העולם השנייה. אני מודה מקרב לב ליוזמתו של רוני, הבן היקר שלנו, שעמד על זאת שעליי להנציח ולהעביר לדורות הבאים תיעוד את מה שעברה המשפחה שלנו, במיוחד מה עבר עליי בזמן מלחמת העולם השנייה.
שמענו רעש של אווירונים, שהודיעו ברדיו, כבר שמענו, שהגרמנים התקיפו את רוסיה.
וכך, ביום ה-21 ביוני 1941, פלשה גרמניה לשטחה של בת בריתה עד אז, ברית המועצות.
אחרי שהגרמנים כבשו את ז'טל, היה שלב של מספר שבועות של כל מיני עינויים, רדיפות וגזירות.
היהודים נצטוו לשאת טלאי צהוב, נאסר עליהם ללכת במדרכות. כעבור זמן נצטוו היהודים למסור את כל דברי הזהב והכסף. 120 איש, ביניהם אישה אחת, מחשובי הקהילה ומשכיליה, נלקחים על ידי הגרמנים לעבודה כביכול.
The morning of August 6, 1942, the screams of terror filled the air as armed German soldiers and their collaborators invaded homes, holding killer dogs to chase the ailing and the helpless Jews out of their homes into the crowded streets of the ghetto.
We heard screaming in the morning, at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. Everybody to come out of the ghetto houses and to gather up in the marketplace. And the screaming and the shouting was unbelievable. Some people tried to hide wherever they could if they had a place to go to. Most of the people did not have. בלית ברירה, without any choice, we all went to the marketplace. Over there, Germans stood all around. We were gathered up like sheep to slaughter.
From this place, the Jews were marched at gunpoint, enduring screams, blows, and threats, towards a cemetery on the outskirts of the town. Upon arrival to the cemetery, beaten and traumatized, they saw what awaited them, large pits awaiting to be filled. The German soldiers and their accomplices did not waste a moment. The Jews were ordered and pushed to lie face down in the mud on the ground.
Face down. And they stood over us and they hit us with their guns and whatever they had in their hands. And we were afraid to keep picking our head up. And we heard screaming and shouting. They called out various specialists.
He lay next to his mother, Batya Golda, his father, Yoel David, and his younger brother, age 10, Ansel. No one dared raise their head from the ground. They all lay still, knowing that the slightest movement could lead to bullets piercing their bodies. After some time, the Germans began calling out names of tradesmen. Those answering to these trades were instructed to raise their hand and await further orders. As they called out names of tradesmen, shoe repairmen, mechanics, no one knew. This meant these people would live or die.
I had a certificate. I worked as a tischler outside the ghetto. I used to make old shoes, wooden shoes for the army, wooden soles for the volunteers. My mother said, "Raise your hand, you're a tischler." I was afraid. A tischler is a carpenter. You have a child tischler, maybe you'll remain alive. I was afraid to leave him go to separate from them. And then she pushed me out. I got up. I had to walk over people who lay around. I walked on them in order to get to that line over there. Those who were called out, they were lined up this way, from here to here. And over there too, we lay down with the halt the Schnitze in Drecke. I still remember it. Keep your nose in the Dreck. Don't lift up. If you move, you got hit over the head. And we laid this way maybe 4 hours, 3 hours, I don't remember. And while we were there, we heard the shooting and the screaming from over here. They kept sending groups of people from the mess that were lying around the field for the pits that were prepared 2 days before. The cries and the yawning and the screaming ceased, stopped. And then we were told to get up. And we got up and looked around. I looked around. This field was clean. Nobody left. Everybody was already shot in the street. Today I got the answer. The answer that I asked from the very first day after it happened. Why was I privileged and selected from all the family to remain by myself? Why was I alive when the others went? Was I better than them? I didn't do anything to remain alive. My mother sent me out. Go, maybe you'll remain alive. I kissed her. And I walked upon people and I lay down in that light. And since then, I still ask, why was I elected to remain? And throughout the 58 years, I never forgot. And today, now I got an answer. Now I got an answer. To raise a family. And they should bring the message further, and they should perpetuate the memory. This is my answer. This is the answer God should have given me. Was I better? Yes. I am proud of my sons. Going my way and thinking along my way, I will continue to carry on the message, and they will convey the message to their children. And I hope the children will learn and know of their grandparents and great-grandparents what happened to them. And this is the answer that I received this morning. Why I was chosen to remain alive 58 years after this day. I am now much older when my father died. Much older when my mother died, my parents. And for me, I only remained alive so I could tell the story, so I could convey the message, not to forget what happened, took place here. This day, 58 years ago, in these hours, is it a miracle? I don't know, I don't believe in miracles, but miracles do happen. The fact is that I remained alive, thanks to many ways and by ways to live to this day, to have my sons and my wife to join me, to come to say goodbye to the graves of my dear ones. I'll never be here again. My last time. Maybe I'll join you then in this time. This is the way it goes. This is the legacy I will leave behind when day comes. Continue. תמשיכו. לא לשכוח. Keep together. Stay together. Keep your family legacy forever. Unbelievable. Could never imagine that I'll live to this day. To come together and cry my heart out. Together with my children who join me in all my ways, in all my feelings, and all my pains. Like one flesh, one body. Together we feel the same way. But I still have a dear, devoted family. And keep dear what's dear. Dear remains within us. This is the way I dedicate my life. I'm happy to say on this spot that I remained alive to be able to raise such a family. Every word that comes out from them comes out from the depth of their hearts and goes into my heart. In this way, this is the only consolation I have. May God bless you for a long life. Just pray from here. You should also live long enough to be able to carry on the message further. To create such an act of devotion, such coming together, a pilgrimage to the past and the dedication to the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you, Nili, Noam, Roslyn. I think only silence is appropriate at this moment, Ronnie, given the impact that we've all experienced today, culminating in the video of your father. So I think we should just reverence what's been recited, these stories. And just take it in. Just take it in. The only thing I can think of that comes to mind as a closing would be the lines of Aeschylus, the great Greek tragedian 2,500 years ago, when he said, "Drop by drop, pain that cannot forget falls upon the heart, until in our despair, against our will, comes wisdom by the awful grace of God." Drop by drop, pain that cannot forget falls upon the heart, till in our despair, against our will, comes wisdom by the awful grace of God. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ronnie, Nili,
Thank you very much.
Roslyn, Noam.
Thank you very much.
Beautiful session. Beautiful session.
Thank you for having us.
We'll see you all again here
you.
tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody,
Bye.
for attending.
Thank you.